Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Hordes Dairyman webcast brought to you by Zoetis. Today, we are pleased to have with us Dr. Mark Kirkpatrick of Zoetis Dairy Technical Services, and he will be sharing his research on the impact a high first test somatic cell count can have on your operation. And as a little preview, it might be more than you think. In his position with Zoetis, Dr. Kirkpatrick works with veterinarians and dairy producers to evaluate their dairy records and put those findings into action. Dr. Kirkpatrick has been with Zoetis for over 20 years, and before that, he practiced in Northeast Iowa for almost a decade. He received his bachelor's, DVM, and a master's in veterinary clinical sciences, all from Iowa State University. And his work at the university included a dual role as the school's herd veterinarian and as a veterinarian for the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Kirkpatrick, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And this is a real privilege to be on the Hordes Dairyman webinar. And so greetings from Idaho. And we're going to be talking about the consequences of a high somatic cell count at first test. And so that's going to be our subject today as we move forward. So one of the things that we're going to be covering, this is going to be the discussion today, is we're going to go ahead and review the 2015 National Mastitis Council presentation on this topic. And we're going to be looking at a term called a high log 1. So the high log 1, I need to go ahead and define that right from the beginning. So this is the first milk test, 5 to 45 days in milk, with a Loglinear somatic cell score greater than a 4.0. And the equivalent of that is greater than a 200,000 actual somatic cell count. So the evaluation that you're seeing actually was inspired by a producer's comment that I saw on Hordes Dairyman, that he was fairly upset that the loss of premiums provided no financial incentive to manage his herd's somatic cell counts. And I just thought, boy, there's got to be more to that than just the premiums. So that's going to be a discussion that we're going to have. The other thing that we're going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief explanation of Loglinear somatic cell scores. What is it? Why do we keep talking about Loglinears? And then I've got an examination of a sample herd to illustrate some of the impacts. So here's just the title slide to the National Mastitis Council, Consequences of a High Somatic Cell Count. And it more than a number. And that's really kind of the big emphasis that I'd like to provide. So here's the methodology. Records were accessed from DairyComp 305 herds that recorded clinical mastitis cases, and they also performed monthly herd milk testing that included somatic cell counts. This worked out to be 22 herds and 164,000 cows. So that's enough to keep a geek like me happy. I eliminated the Jersey and the crossbred cows from the evaluation, so this is all Holstein cattle in an effort to go ahead and standardize this evaluation. So thinking again about disease incidences, the record systems do a great job of giving the producer the opportunity to record significant things that happen in a cow's life. And they call these things conditions or events. And these have impacts on production, reproductive efficiency, and longevity. And a lot of times we just don't see it, or we don't have the tools sometimes. Well, I'm looking at a high first Loglinear somatic cell score. It is a numerical designation, but I'd like to put in front of you today that it is as much a condition or an event as mastitis or metritis, and it has impacts on the cow's lactation. And again, as a reminder here, the threshold that we're using is a 200,000 cell count or a Loglinear score of greater than 4.0. Those are the equivalents. And we're looking at this point of saying that anything over 200,000 cell count is going to be indicative of a cow that has subclinical mastitis. So we're going to look, at clinical mastitis within the first 60 days. Every one of us knows that the clinical mastitis, in this case, it could be a negative event on the cow. If we go ahead and look at milk production, this is the graphic showing the display curve of this, the individuals in blue are the individuals that did not have a clinical mastitis in the first 60 days. The individuals in orange are the individuals that did. And And the thing that's really surprising to me is I, fully expected to see a milk reduction. I didn't expect to see it finally equilibrate out at 270 days in milk. My gosh, that's a long effect. And, this effect has long tails. The other thing I'd like to point out to you when you start to look at this first 60 days of lactation in clinical mastitis, the aggregate proportion affected in this population was 11.3%. 1 out of 10 individuals had clinical mastitis in the first 60 days. So that's pretty significant. It's a big problem. But now let's go ahead and look at high somatic cell counts at first test. What does that do impacting milk production? So here we are. This is building up right now. I was really struck when I looked at this. And again, we're looking at the same type of situation here. The blue represents the individuals that did not have a high log 1, a high somatic cell score on the first test. And the orange represents the individuals that did. And I was really struck by the difference in milk production. And then the effect lasted out to 210 days in milk before the lactation curves equilibrated. I think it's even more important is the herd aggregate proportion affected was 22%. 22% for high somatic cell count at first test against the mastitis in the first 60 days of 11%. So when we think about mastitis, 1 in 10 affected. When we think about high somatic cell score at first test, we're thinking 1 out of 5 affected. So it really is a very broad-based condition. So let's go ahead and look at what that actual milk yield loss differential is. And so at this point, the first thing that I looked at was clinical mastitis in the first 60 days. I calculated the differences in the curves, and what that represents is a loss of 1,007 pounds of milk production. If I value that at $18 a hundredweight, that was $181 gross lost milk yield. But I do need to account for feed costs at 13 cents a dry matter pound. And so thinking about income over feed costs, the net loss in this case would be $129 of lost revenue for looking at milk production losses for individuals that are affected with this condition. Now let's look at the high log 1s. High log 1s, the calculated differences in the curves represented 1,583 pounds of milk production loss, and that would be valued at $285 gross lost milk yield. But then when I look at income over feed costs, it's $203 loss from this test population. So $203 versus $129. Both of those are revenue sinks, or actually think it in terms of being revenue parasites. There are critical elements in controlling the fresh cow log 1. The first one that we always want to look at is to go ahead and think about controlling the environment. The first assumption is that perhaps we're creating this condition prior to the freshening event. So in the case of looking at the environment, these cows are starting to build up the mammary gland just prior to freshening. There may be some leaking involved. There's the opportunity for the ingress of pathogens. So think about controlling the environment. And the other thing about dry cows is a lot of times they are the forgotten individuals. So we need to keep an eye on the environment that they occupy. The other thing is we need to resolve any underlying dry period infections, and this would be on the mature individuals that have already completed their first lactation. So we're thinking about dry cow therapy, effective dry cow programs, and this could include something like SpectraMast DC. I'm an absolute believer in the use of internal teat sealants. I think that was a real revolution. The product like Orbiseal helps to prevent new infections, so that's critical as well. The other tool that we have in our box is vaccination with a core antigen vaccine like EnviroCore J5, and this is to help control the presence of coliform mastitis during the lactation. So let's think about what the summaries are, and we're going to step back again to the clinical mastitis in the first 60 days in milk. We saw lost milk yield in this study, and that was 1,007 pounds. But the individuals were also at more risk of being removed in the first 60 days. If we look at no mastitis, the removal rate was 7.8% in the first 60 days. But if they had clinical mastitis, that advanced to 13.7%, for a differential of almost 6 percentage points. The odds ratio, looking at this, is almost a 2 to 1. It's 1.89 to 1 increased risk factor for the individuals that had clinical mastitis. I looked then and asked the question, okay, by 120 days in milk, what are the loss rates? If we look at no mastitis, that was almost 11%, and clinical mastitis was 21%, for a difference of almost 10 percentage points. There are also other losses. So this clinical condition of mastitis extracts a penalty in reproductive efficiency. So we're looking at an additional 17 days open for these individuals to become pregnant. Now let's look at the same thing for the high log 1. So looking at the log 1, we've got lost milk production of 1,583 pounds. If we look at the individuals that had a low first test in the first 5 to 45 days in milk, less than 200,000 somatic cell, the loss rate for those individuals was 2.3% removed by 60 days in milk. If we look at the first test greater than 200,000, now that advanced to almost 6.5% for a difference of 4.23%. The odds ratio difference between those is 3 to 1. If we look at the risk of clinical mastitis in the first 60 days, in the individuals that were low, less than 200,000, it was 7.9%. In the individuals greater than 200,000, it was 25.6%. Quite an increase in risk, and so that differential was 17.8% for an odds ratio of 4 to 1. Additionally, there was reproductive efficiency was lost, and so there was an additional 17 days open that was accrued for those individuals that had a high first test and greater than a 200,000 cell count. So the impact of mastitis and a high log 1 is not simple. There's multiple factors at play here. So again, just to redefine, a high log 1 is the first Loglinear score greater than a 4.0 or the equivalent, which is a 200,000 cell count. I would like to put in front of you, again, I should say this is 5 to 45 days in milk. I'd like to put in front of you that this is as much a disease condition as clinical mastitis. So it's important to keep track of this. Having the condition of a high log 1 is associated with significant lower lactational milk production, 1,583 pounds, greater mastitis risk of almost 8% versus 25.6%, greater removal from the herd, 2.3% versus 6.5%, and reduced reproductive efficiency, 17 additional days open. There is a long trail behind this condition. So we think about controlling this. The losses are avoidable using proven scientific interventions. First case is manage the dry cow environment. Consider using a highly efficacious dry cow therapy to address existing infections like Spectrum DC. Use an internal teat sealant to reduce the new dry period infections like using Orbisil. And use a core antigen vaccine like EnviroCore J5 to aid in the control of clinical signs of E. coli mastitis. So this is a big point right here. You know, going back to the original thing that kind of sparked looking into this, even in the face of no milk quality premiums, it still remains in the producer's best financial interest to manage somatic cell counts. You don't want to let up on this. I'm a real advocate for routine production testing and determination of subclinical mastitis. I think it has really great management value in addressing herd and individual udder health. It really gives us a granular view to understand what populations are affected and when are they affected. Again, my premise here is a high log 1, which is a numerical classification, is as much a disease as clinical mastitis, and it extracts significant penalties. So let's go ahead and just look at the sample herd milk quality, just to kind of put this into action. My colleague, Dr. John Lee, has actually created a user device in the guide section of DairyComp. And what he has here is he does have commands that are available. And the important thing that I'd like you to see about this is that he runs the commands in 2 sections. For lactations equal to 1 and lactations greater than 1. It's really important at this point to understand that those are different populations, and it's important to perform a differential monitoring. This is a tool that I use. I extract the last 480 days of milk, individual cow milk test data, and go ahead and put that together and summarize that. One of the other things I like to do with this is I also like to capture the current pricings for fat and protein, other solids, and the producer price differential to understand what the value of the components is when we look at the individual cows. Now, I mentioned that I was going to bring up log-linear somatic cell scores, and this is the classic logarithmic curve. So one of the things you'll see on the bottom is the log score, and that extends from 0 and actually extends to 10. But it's 0 to 10, and if you look on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, that's somatic cell counts. And so this is how these two are related. So Dr. George Shook from University of Wisconsin in 1982 identified that this might be a way to improve interpretability of the data. One of the things that he noticed is that there was a linear relationship with milk production losses and log linear scores. The other thing that's kind of important, this is kind of geek speak, is you can't average somatic cell counts because these are not normally distributed. If you go ahead and run this out in a graphic, you'll see all of the results plastered over on the left-hand side. It's not a normal distribution. And as we understand with looking at genomics, everything lives in a bell curve. And so the logarithmic conversion of the somatic cell count to a log score actually starts to create a normal distribution, and then we can use the log scores to go ahead and average and perform statistical functions. So that's really an important consideration here. The other thing is I'd like to put this in motion for you, and you'll see that I'm building up these boxes. Every time that you increase one full log linear score, you are doubling your somatic cell count. That's really an important concept here. So if we look at a log linear score of 7, we see that that's equivalent to 1.6 million. If we see a log linear score of 8, now that is advanced to 3.2 million. So wherever you're at, increase of one full log score actually doubles the somatic cell count. So this is looking at some of the output. And what you see right here, this is looking at a herd. And one thing I'd like to emphasize right from the start is you'll see 3 lines. Any herd that we look at actually consists of 4 herds. We're used to thinking of all cattle. That's herd number 1. But then we also have the lactation 1s, the lactation group 2s, and the lactation group 3 pluses. They all have different dynamics, and we need to monitor all of those consistently to understand how the condition of subclinical mastitis and somatic cell counts is affecting these populations. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see a grid and you'll see a lot of color over there. That's called heat mapping, and what that does is it just helps us to say, given your history, where do you face increased cell counts? And we can see that wintertime in this particular case is starting to cause elevated cell counts. And most people would say, yep, that's no surprise. Now, looking at this score, I am painting this out as log linear scores because I can go ahead and do all the arithmetic and statistical activity on log linear scores. So my goal for a herd is I'd like to be around 2. 3 is at a point, if you ever have your population hit the value of 3, that should be considered an important caution zone. When you hit a 4, the average cow in that group is subclinically infected. So that's how serious that is, and I like to think in terms of 2, 3, and 4. Now, if you look at the very best, when we get in a herd that gets down to 1.5 as an average, that herd is consistently under 100,000 bulk tank somatic cell score. So think of 2, 3, and 4, but 1.5, man, that's outstanding. Now, if I do an estimated bulk tank somatic cell count for this herd, we're looking at about 149,000 throughout the entire history. Now, one thing we can go ahead and do is I have in this, every cow is set up to have marked, did she or did she not have a high log 1? And then all of her readings then at that point are tagged with that designation. So what I did was I went in and said, okay, I'd like to just see the cows that have a high or low log 1, the clean cows. Where would they be at? And if you look at the averages over on the left-hand side of the graph, you see that they're approaching 1.5, which is outstanding. if I do an estimated bulk tank somatic cell count, if the herd consisted only of these cattle that are low at first test, their bulk tank somatic cell score would be about 110,000. Wow, that's great. Now, if I do the converse and only look at the individuals that came in with a high log 1, what would their bulk tank somatic cell score be? And at this point, the estimation would be 322,000. Again, what this does is every cow is marked up with the designation, did you or did you not have a high log 1 at first test? And we actually create two separate herds. In this point, there's a lot of pain here when we're starting to look at a herd that is, on the average, running 322,000 bulk tank somatic cell score. And again, this is the test 5 to 45 days in milk, greater than 200,000. So again, to the premise, this condition has some long tails to it. So let's think about monitoring log 1 status. I mentioned what Dr. John Lee is doing with dairy comp. Essentially, this is looking at about the same thing. And what I like to do is, this is called an outlier analysis. I want to know the proportion of individuals that have greater than a 200,000 cell count. The more individuals that are monitored on this, this actually works fairly good for larger herds. But what you're looking at is, I would like to have no more than about 10% that are affected. In this case, we can see that the lactation 2s are running about 13%. The lactation group 3s are about 17%. There may be some opportunity to affect that area. But then we look at the lactation 1s, and they're on the average running about 27% of the individuals that have a high log 1 at first test. So about 1/3 of the population. So this kind of says, this is probably a population that we ought to be looking into. So what are the things that we would be concerned about in this particular case? Well, we're always concerned, number one, with the pre-calving environment. Is there any anomalies there that these individuals may be becoming contaminated prior to, they're getting teat contamination prior to freshening? Is there any opportunity there? If there's a condition like udder edema, that possibly could lead into the same type of scenario. Now, these individuals, when they enter the parlor for the first time, have swollen teats. They don't have good neural innervation of the teat ends, and they don't have a good milk out experience. So that possibly could be a confounding factor here, or a complicating factor. Another thing, my colleagues have noticed is they like to watch watch the lactation 1s coming into the parlors for the first time, and just note, how good an experience did that heifer have? Is she coming in fairly calm, or is it a situation that's out of control for her? And at that point, that's an area that we need to consider. The other thing that we're looking at here is, you'll see that it's very episodic in the percentages that are affected. Now, that may be due to the number of individuals that freshen, but the episodic nature really kind of concerns me, and I don't have a good answer for that at this point. The other thing that we ought to reach for is that let's consider culturing these individuals as they freshen. Is there a dominant organism at play here that we need to be aware of? You need to know your enemy. And so what I would do on doing cultures is make sure that you get speciated cultures, so you have an idea of what specific organism could be at play. Also be sure and include any clinical mastitis samples that you might have. Now, I mentioned in this case, this is an outlier analysis. Another very legitimate way to look at this is just to average all the log 1s for all the individuals as they freshen. And that technique works really nicely in smaller herds, because what it does is it tends to even things out a little bit, and you'll be able to see trends. And in that case, I want to be as close to 2 as possible for these individuals, thinking about the results. So let's look at what the economic impacts may be, thinking about a herd. So this is a summary that I go ahead and put together. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see a designation of low LSC1, that's also a low log 1, or a high LSC1. I go ahead and segregate the populations and look at the aggregate lactation curve. And I'm looking at the lactation curve for the first 120 days in milk. So 120 days in milk, and thinking about 480 days worth of lactational records. In this case, I've got 10,483 readings that I can go ahead and put my fingers on. There is quite a difference when we're looking at energy-corrected milk production in the lactation 1s, the 2s, and the 3s. So this says that there is really some opportunity here. We need to understand at any given test what's the proportion of individuals that are affected, and that's all put together. And then the number of cattle in the test day group, because we need to know how many are producing in that first 120 days. And then what's the sum of milk hundredweights for that test day group. Now below that, you'll see opportunity cost per milk hundredweight. So this is kind of a way of saying, what's on the table here? What could we attain? And one thing I want to be very clear about is you'll see 74 cents per hundredweight listed for the heifers. If I could capture 100% of the damage and equilibrate these or get rid of the high log ones, in that particular case, the increase in milk production would be the same as actually seeing a 74 cents per hundredweight increase in milk price. So that's just kind of another way of thinking about how much pain is involved with this. Now, I fully recognize that we'll never get to that point of actually fixing 100% of the population, but we do need to know what kind of dollars are on the table. Over on the left-hand side, I have it broke out by lactation groups, 1, 2s, and 3 pluses. I'm looking at 365 days of lactation, and I have this valued at $18 per hundredweight. Now, that would be 18 cents a pound, and then I subtract 5 cents a pound to cover for feed costs. So I do need to recognize that it takes feed to make milk. And so at that point, we have $41,000 of opportunity, and that is after feed costs have been taken off. So in this case, we're looking at across the herd, there could be close to about $96,000 of opportunity. What we need to know is that to fix things costs money. And so what this does, this is an exercise to say how many dollars are on the table and what can I think about if I need to make some changes, can I go ahead and pencil this out? And that $96,000 estimate is if I could fix 100% of the problem. So we do know that there's dollars on the table. Let's take it one step further. And what's happening here is that we're looking at the data coming through to say there are also other impacts on pregnancy rate, mastitis, clinical mastitis rates, removal rates, and then the proportion of chronics in the population. I put valuations to pregnancy rate, mastitis, and removal rates. So if we look at the heifers, which is the blue side, the left side, they've got incredible pregnancy rates in these individuals, but you do see that there is a reduction in pregnancy rate for the individuals that do have a high log 1. And this is determined from dairy comp records. Look at mastitis. We have a 0.9% mastitis rate in the heifers, in the individuals that are clean, and the individuals that are dirty with a high log 1, it's 7.9%. So there's an increase in clinical mastitis cases. They hold on to these cattle, and there's no differential in removal rates for this particular herd. And if I look at a 2x2 analysis and say, okay, what's the proportion of chronics? In the low log ones, it's 4.3%, and in the high log ones, it's 19.6%. So we've got a lot of risk that's involved. So I look at the total number of cows at freshen. I'm just throwing out a theoretical $5 cost of intervention per cow per year, and that number you just need to figure out what kind of intervention would I have and what would that be. And the other thing I've got highlighted there for you to see is a 30% that I think I can positively affect. So if we look at the net returns in terms of milk production, improved reproduction, clinical mastitis reduction, the return per dollar invested could be $5.50. It just says that, do I think I can go ahead with my case to spend money to fix this issue? The same thing applies over on the lactation 2s and 3s. Over on the right-hand side, the same calculations. We have a reduction in pregnancy rate, increase in clinical mastitis. There's a slight increase in removals in the first 30 days. And then we can also view the percentage of chronics for the low log 1s versus the percentage of somatic cell chronics in the high log 1s. And again, in this case, looking at the number of cows at freshing, looking at a $5 investment, figuring that we're going to have a positive impact in 30% of the population, there could be about a $3 per dollar investment ROI. So it's just kind of a way of kind of saying, how much is this hurting me? How much can I invest to go ahead and fix this? So there are some messages to the herd is that, wow, energy-corrected milk on a whole herd basis for you folks is just outstanding. It really says, you are paying a lot of attention to detail. You're getting a lot of things right. But it also represents opportunity. If we look at all the lactation groups affected with a high log 1, which is about 20%, there is production loss that can be measured in energy-corrected milk. So at this point, this may be very well worth acting on. The lactation group 1 population is the most affected by this condition, and we'd like to think about investigating the root causes. Let's look at the pre-calving environment. Let's consider udder edema. Let's also develop a database on what the organism types are. We're doing some speciated isolations. And then the next question is why the variability in monthly proportion affected? The only way to really wrap our arms around that is to see what the actual conditions are. This group, the lactation group 1 population, demonstrates the greatest financial opportunity due to decreased production, decreased pregnancy rate, and an increased mastitis rates. A $5 investment that could positively impact 30% of the population could have about a 5.5 to 1 return on investment. At least at this point, we have some markers on the table to say, okay, what can we do about this situation, and what kind of return on investment could there be? So with that, I hope that kind of explains my thoughts on the significance of a high log 1. I think it's a condition that's very important to monitor and well worth your time monitoring. And again, I would say too, I'm a big advocate for monthly testing and having that ability to look at that detail. With that, I'd certainly be open for any questions. Thank you again for attending.
Thank you, Dr. Kirkpatrick. Yes, that was quite an informational presentation. We do have a couple questions we can go through here to dive into that a little deeper. The first one I want to talk about is if a farm does identify they have a high first test SCC, what should be the first step that they take to address that?
A really good question on that. We've identified that there is an issue. And so one of those, I think, is first off to address all of those points. I would look at, what population is being affected. Is it the lactation group 1s? Is it the older cows? Typically, we see some of the older cows. So at that point, one of the things I would really like to look at, if I got access to the data, is what is the performance of the dry cow program? If I go ahead and do what's called a 2x2 analysis of the dry program, I'd like to see the new infection risk down to about 10%, and I'd like to see the cure risk approaching 80% if I can get there. So those are a couple of numbers that I calculate using a 2x2 analysis. And to be able to do that, I need to know what the dry-off Loglinear score was for these cows, and also the first test Loglinear score. And that's what we use to compare looking at a 2x2 analysis. So that'd be one thing. The next thing is I'd like to get a kind of a physical view of what's the space that these cows occupy. Looking at the older cows and the younger cows and seeing if there's any risk there to be aware of. The next thing is if the numbers are high enough, I shouldn't even say high enough, I would really like to develop a pathogen profile for the herd for the fresh cows. So thinking in terms of let's go ahead and consider doing some cultures and doing speciated cultures, and then be able to figure out what kind of organism may be at play there. So those would be kind of some of my first steps that I would do to address that.
Very good. Yeah, we had another question talking about what would be the best way to identify those pathogens, which you talked about a little bit. Another angle would be
Caitlin, if I could add into that,
sure.
The speciated culture is just, there's some very good resources out there. And one thing I've been very pleased with is there's a MALDI determination. And so that's matrix-assisted laser diffusion ionization. And university laboratories can do that actually at a relatively, modest cost. And the speciation is just nailed down to there's just no question what the organism is that you're looking at. So that's a really valuable database.
Very good, very good. Kind of along the same line, it could be that or also SCC. Is bulk tank testing enough, or should we be looking at individual cow data?
Oh, that's kind of a loaded question for me. And one of the things when I'm talking to folks, I say, mention to them is I always believe averages dumb things down. And boy, if there is ever, I mean, it's very useful to know what your bulk tank is doing and to be able to see the variability. And I fully encourage you to monitor that. But it really is the big mixing vat, and it doesn't give us the granularity that we need to understand what's happening in the lactation 1 population, the lactation group 2 population, or the 3 pluses. So I'm a real advocate for individual cow testing.
Excellent perspective, yes. This next question is, what are some environmental factors we can look at and what can we control to reduce the risk for a high first test somatic cell count?
Well, one of the things is we think about a high log 1 and we make the assumption that, all the damage occurs prior to the, prior to the start of lactation. And that may not necessarily be true. So we need to have kind of an open mind, is this a problem that's created prior to the start of lactation, or or is it being created after the cow freshens? So the first thing that I'd really want to look at is I'd like to just kind of do kind of thinking about an environmental assessment. What's the conditions that these dry cows or these close-up cows are in at this point? As these cows are kind of bagging up to get started into their lactation, there may be some milk leakage, and boy, is that an opportunity for a pathogen to make it into the mammary gland and basically set up shop and create a new infection. So I would really first go would be to look at the environment of the individual, and then the next part of that would be to have a look at the parlor and see what kind of experience these individuals have once they enter the parlor. Is there any chance that they're not having a good experience, and that may lead to some problems?
Absolutely. And you've been talking about the dry period so much. One part about your first study I found interesting was that extended days open for the cows with mastitis. Could you talk a little bit more about why somatic cell is impacting the reproductive efficiency?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. One of the first places that we looked at is Dairy Comp actually has a routine called a Kaplanmeier survival analysis, and it's built into the program. And so the Kaplanmeier is what it does is it creates a curve that drops every time that you see an individual that's affected with the condition. And we're very familiar with the Kaplanmeier analysis when we look at reproductive efficiency. So that's a place that it indicates that a lot of conditions actually create a penalty for increased days open. And so a lot of times thinking about that, we're looking at inflammatory conditions. And inflammatory conditions, if you look at clinical mastitis and think of the worst of the worst, with like a coliform mastitis, the presence of endotoxin can have an effect on ovulation. It can have a negative effect on the ability of implantation of the embryo. There's all sorts of number of reasons, but let's think in terms of increased inflammation. And so increased inflammation can have an effect on reproductive efficiency.
Excellent, thank you. This next question, we want to talk about a little bit more about data analysis. If we're looking to interpret our own data, where would be a good place for a farm to start looking?
I remember, when I started practice, I have very clearly in mind walking into the offices of a lot of my producers and then seeing a stack of DHIA reports, that are basically composting on top of the file cabinet. So get them opened up, and then the big thing is get somebody to help you, talk through these things. What am I seeing here, and what can I put my finger on that matters to me in monitoring milk quality? And there's some pretty talented individuals out there that could just help you even just look at your monthly printout report for one thing. But the thing that was so intriguing is that we went from paper to computer. And so the computer allows us now to have the ability to really dig in on populations. And again, what I would do would be to start simple. Make sure that you look at the metrics that really count. And so looking at a high log 1, I think is a very doable metric that almost ought to be monitored on a monthly basis if you're performing the testing to get the real value out of your testing.
It's a great point. We have a lot of data, but it's not worth much if we don't look at it. As
Absolutely.
we're getting close to the end of our presentation here, we have a couple kind of wrap-up questions. I think I know what your answer is going to be to this one, but someone says, my SCC is already pretty low and there is no milk premium. Is it still worth the investment to address that?
Well, if your SCC is pretty low, congratulations. That's great. But what exactly is it? What there's a pretty broad definition of what pretty good is. Is it 100,000? Is it 200,000? Is it 300,000? Probably not 300,000, but it's up for definition. Get somebody to kind of help you decide what good enough is, and get a review of it. And then the other thing is, I'm always surprised. That how much damage can actually, can be there. You need to be aware of what the possibilities are.
Absolutely. And then we saw in your second example was on a 1,700 cow dairy. Would you expect to see something similar on a smaller herd, or how might we interpret that?
Yeah, physiology is physiology. So and so populations, I started out practice actually working with 30 cow herds, 50 cow herds, and I thought 300 cows was monstrous. So yeah, at this point, yeah, the dynamics are exactly the same. Physiology is physiology.
Great point. Great point. Well, we are very close to the top of our presentation right now, so I want to thank you again for sharing your time with us. We thank everyone for joining us for our Zoetis webcast today. I'm Caitlin Allen, Hordes Dairyman, and on behalf of Zoetis and Dr. Kirkpatrick, we're happy to have you. Hope you learned something, and thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.